From the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y, hello and welcome to our civic series, Race to City Hall. My name is Seth Pinsky and I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y. I'm honored to be here to host these one-on-one conversations with leading mayoral candidates, covering topics of importance to all New Yorkers, including some suggested by members of our 92nd Street Y community. Thank you all so much for joining us. As we all know, the last year has been an incredibly difficult one for our city. To overcome our challenges, New York is going to need a decisive, collaborative, and creative chief executive. It is for this reason that we at the 92nd Street Y have launched this series. Today, I'm speaking with mayoral candidate Joycelyn Taylor. Ms. Taylor is currently the CEO of TaylorMade Contracting, a general contracting firm specializing in residential, commercial, and public works projects. She's also the founder and chair of the New York City MWBE Alliance. Prior to starting her own firm, Ms. Taylor worked as an operations manager for AIG and at the New York State Division of Housing. Ms. Taylor, thank you so much for being here and talking with me.
Thank you so much, Seth, for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we're really happy to have you here. And before diving into questions about your positions on various policies, I did want to just start by asking how you and your family have been holding up during the pandemic.
Well, you know what? Thank you so much for asking. I appreciate that. We've been holding up pretty well. Fortunately for us, we haven't had anyone immediately within my family that's been affected by COVID. But we've been practicing our safe distancing and doing what we need to do. We're holding up pretty well.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I hope that everyone stays safe and healthy.
Thank you. Your family as well, Seth.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I do want to dive into a series of questions about your policy positions, but I thought that maybe a good place for us to start was something that you and I had been talking about just before we started broadcasting. And that is that you were talking about the fact that this is your first time running for office. And I know you have experience in government, but you've never actually been a candidate before. And I was wondering if you could just talk briefly about what inspired you to get into the race and what the experience has been like for you.
Sure. So, what inspired me to get into the race, I think, is what a lot of New Yorkers are experiencing. We're tired. People are tired of having the same conversations over and over again and not actually seeing the results that, we need to see so that people could be whole, purposeful human beings in this city, state, and in this country. So after having had a number of conversations with elected officials and various other people and not really seeing the results, I was moved by what Shirley Chisholm said. Either you can complain about it or you can do something about it. And I decided to run for mayor and do something about it. Because the reality of the situation is this, Seth, whether you believe in God, spirit, universe, Allah, they created heaven and earth. We created a lot of the issues and challenges that people are experiencing every day in the city. And if it's not working, the laws, the policy procedures that we created, if they're not working, we have to create the change. So, I decided to get into this race. First time running, I'm running for mayor, and it's been a whirlwind. It's been, ups and downs. Someone has said to me before I decided to run, you will literally experience every emotion there is if you run for office. And they were not lying, Seth.
Well, I hope that those emotions are largely on the positive end of the spectrum. But I did want to talk about some of those challenges that you alluded to, and maybe we can start with the economy. You are a business owner, and I know that a lot of business owners in New York were struggling even before the pandemic. You hear when you go out, especially speaking to small business owners, about the red tape, the fines, the fees, the taxes, all the obstacles that government puts in the way of success. And then clearly what's happened during the pandemic has only exacerbated that situation. I'm wondering, as maybe a first question, if I can ask you, as a business owner, what is, in your opinion, what were the greatest challenges that were facing New York City's small businesses pre-pandemic? And then since the pandemic has hit, how have those challenges changed?
That's a great question. You know, as a small business owner who's done work with the city before, prior to the pandemic, a lot of small businesses were experiencing a lot of bureaucracy. You know, the city spends $22 billion in the procurement of goods and services. And to be honest, there was not a huge amount of opportunity for small businesses to have access to those opportunities. So you know, a lot of small businesses were experiencing that, but they were experiencing the bureaucracy that goes along with trying to do work with the city, whether you're doing it with the government or not. There are a lot of policies that we implemented that just don't work for small business owners. And when they don't work for small business owners, they don't have a recourse to even find solutions to help them to be able to do better. And I think that, you know, there are a lot of positive things that go on in the city, but we don't have enough effective communication. What is the result that we want to see? How can we help businesses to do better? And I think, you know, with the pandemic, it's only exacerbated that issue because a lot of small businesses are struggling. You know, they were struggling prior to the pandemic.
And I guess let's assume that you win the primary in June and then you win the election in November and you're actually the next mayor of our city. As somebody who has experience dealing with all of those challenges, what are the 2 or 3 first things that you would do that you think would be most quickly effective to help small businesses during this period?
Yeah, well, you know, for small businesses that are doing work with the city, a lot of their projects have been put on hold during this pandemic. I think and a lot of these firms actually still have what they call retainage that's being held by the city. So I think one of the first things that we can do to assist small businesses is that if we have firms that have been doing work with the city, that the city is currently holding their retainage, we can release those funds so that they can get capital into their businesses without having to borrow money. But the other thing that we need to do is look for opportunities, and I want to invest at least $1 billion in giving small businesses and small landlords the opportunity to recover from the pandemic. If we were able to provide grants for small business owners and for landlords, we can then ensure, if we developed a program where based upon those grants, they would provide, let's say, rent forgiveness, then we can create a win-win situation where we're not only helping the landlords, but we're helping the tenants. So those are some of the things that I'm looking at and I will look at as mayor. But the other most big important aspect of what we can do to help them is create opportunities for them to actually do business with the city. If your business doesn't have a way to do business right now, if you're a restaurant and you're struggling, then let's partner with restaurants and see if maybe we can give them a contract to do meals in a school close by 1 or 2 days a week. I want to be creative about actually engaging small businesses and letting them be more of the firms that the city continues to work with.
And what do you think the obstacles to that are currently? Why aren't more small businesses able to do business with the city, given the billions of dollars that the city spends every year?
Well, I think that the biggest obstacle is access to capital. You know, the way the city operates, when you get a contract with the city actually expects you to put your money out and wait to be reimbursed. And one of the things that we know is true is that the city is not the best payer. You know, when it comes to paying invoices, it's a challenge. You know, they may have things in place that say you're supposed to get paid in 30 days, but it doesn't happen. And if we want to expand capacity, you know, it's not about these firms even having capacity. If we want to expand the number of firms that we want to do business with, the firm should bring the capability, the city should bring the capacity and, you know, the finances for their projects. I think if we developed a graduated deposit program based upon vetting various firms, that we would have more firms that would actually do business with the city. And that's one of the things that I want to develop. I think if we change the procurement process so that if you're a certified firm right now, if you're an MWBE certified firm, you have to certify with 10 different agencies. right? If we streamline that process and made it more centralized, you would have more firms that want to be involved with working with the city. But right now, the biggest challenge is access to capital, because people shouldn't have to borrow money or use their credit to do work for the city. They have no vested interest in the project or the service that they're providing. So if we provide that access to capital, and if we change the procurement system to truly provide opportunities intentionally, and if we make the payment process more streamlined and efficient, we can truly have more small businesses involved in doing work with the city, and we can make sure that they're successful, because we don't want them to just work with the city. We want to make sure that they're successful.
So we've been talking about the relationship between small businesses and the city and the challenges that currently exist and how you would change those. Another challenge that you alluded to was the challenge between small businesses and landlords. And one of the interesting proposals that I saw on your website is that you're calling for reserving a certain amount of affordable commercial space for small businesses and affordable housing projects, and also potentially for commercial rent control for small businesses. And that's a concept that I have to admit has personally intrigued me for a long time. I mean, I've wondered if we do that with housing, why wouldn't we do that to help struggling businesses? But the obstacle that I've always run into in my head is that it's very easy to determine which households need help based on their income, but it's very hard to define which businesses are struggling. You know, you can be a small business and be successful, or you can be a small business and be struggling. And so I guess I have a question for you, which is, if you were to be elected and advance your affordable commercial space proposal, how would you ensure that the small businesses that are getting these benefits aren't, you know, two-person hedge funds or a small high-end clothing retailer or something like that, but really struggling businesses?
Well, you know, the one thing that the city has always been great at is collecting data, right? We know the finances of businesses. You know, one of the things that I would do to ensure that we're helping the right firms is look at that data, ask them to provide the necessary documentation to see where their firm is at, and, you know, to support their need. It's the same way we do when we're talking about affordable housing, right? In order to qualify for affordable housing, you have to show your pay stubs, you have to show various information. So we would just model that in the same way with a commercial space. And we have to determine, you know, what we deem a business being successful, and how we want to be able to help a particular business. So I would look at the firm's financial information. They would have to pre-qualify to be able to be part of it. But I do think that is something that we need to be talking about, because commercial rents are so high. And it's extremely hard for a lot of these small businesses to survive, given the cost for space in itself. And if we want them to be successful, we have to give them the tools and the resources to make that happen.
Let me, just building on this conversation where we've been focusing on small businesses, I'm wondering if you think that big business has a role to play in the recovery, and if so, what do you think that role is, and what would you do as mayor to work with big business to try to bring them to the table?
You know, the one thing I think we've all learned from this pandemic is that when we don't help each other, we all suffer the repercussions of not helping each other. And in this moment, I would reach out to big business and ask them to do their fair share, to pay their part. Because, you know, the one thing that is very important for all us to understand is that none of us are our best selves by ourselves. We're all connected, especially within the city. There are no borders. So while I understand that, you know, a lot of times in big business, it's about the bottom line. It's about, you know, tax breaks and all of that type of thing. In this moment, where are we at? Someone has to be willing to have that conversation. So one, we have to have that conversation with a long-term plan as to how this is not going to be a forever type of situation. But this is how I need for you to step up in this moment so that we're all okay. with a plan moving forward that if we address this, we don't have to pay for it again going forward in the long term. It's just like the issue with housingness, right? One of the things I've said is that you want to address homelessness, you give homeless people addresses. The great thing about that is once you give a homeless person an address, you don't have to pay to give them another address, right? They're okay. And, you know, within my administration, that's how I'm going to look at things. How are we going to create those long-term impacts so that we don't continue to pay for the same things over and over again? If we look at the homeless budget, we're paying $3.2 billion right now for homeless services. It's as though we keep putting more money into it, but we're not seeing the results. So I think if someone is able to have conversation with the big business owners and get them to understand and see my plan as it relates to pay more now, with us understanding that we're going to implement long-term solutions so that we can possibly pay less later.
And it's interesting because in the conversation about small business, the conversation focused around what government can do to help small businesses. And I mean, for understandable reasons, when you're talking about big business, you're talking about what big business can do to help government or society. Do you think that there are steps that you as mayor could take that would make New York more desirable to these companies so they hire more New Yorkers and generate more economic activity? Or do you think that's not, we should be really focusing on small business and not worry about big business so much?
Well, listen, as New York is almost the capital of the world, right? Everyone wants to be in New York. And the reason why we have to focus on small businesses is because they're struggling, right? Amazon made over $1 trillion during this pandemic. They don't need us to focus on them. We have to focus on the businesses and the people in the city that are vulnerable, because until we lift them up, then none of us are going to be okay. So it's not that we don't care about big business, but in this moment, we can't give you tax breaks and incentives that we don't have. It's sort of, it would be as though I need money for my mortgage, right? But I'm lending you money right now or giving you a break, right? Just because I want you to continue to be my friend. We can't operate in that way anymore. It just doesn't make sense, because in the long term, everyone ends up losing, and we continue to have these same conversations over and over again. I'm trying to create an administration that will get us out of the position of having these conversations over and over again. That's the place that we have to be at. So from my perspective, yes, we want big businesses to be here, but we need for them to partner with us. We need for them to see where we are in this moment and to offer their level of assistance so that we can help the small businesses that need to be able to survive this.
So you were talking about the need for government to focus on the vulnerable. And you mentioned earlier the topic of affordable housing. And you yourself say on your campaign website that affordability is the #1 social injustice that working class New Yorkers face. So maybe if we can shift gears and talk a little bit about affordable housing. And where I wanted to start with something was with something that I think you're uniquely positioned to discuss, given your own personal history, which is NYCHA, the city's housing authority, which houses somewhere between 400 and 600,000 New Yorkers, among the most vulnerable New Yorkers that we have. You grew up in NYCHA housing. You, I think, were yours was one of the first African-American families to move into the pink houses in East New York. So I'm wondering if you can maybe share with our patrons a couple of things. One is, given that unique perspective that you have, what do you think the major challenges that NYCHA and its residents are facing right now? And what, as mayor, would you do to try to address those challenges?
Yeah, you know, the major challenge and the thing that NYCHA residents are facing right now is the disrepair of the NYCHA developments. The city has not invested in NYCHA in the way that it needed to invest in a very, very long time. And if you go to any one of the NYCHA developments, it shows, right? It's just like when you own your own home. If you don't maintain it, eventually things will start to fall apart. And that's what we've allowed to do with, the NYCHA developments, but I remain hopeful and optimistic. I'm very excited about the president's infrastructure plan, which includes $300 billion for housing. I've already reached out to the president and the vice president and asked that, they look at giving New York City that $40 billion we need to reinvest in NYCHA and make it whole. Because we've done a disservice to 400 to 600,000 residents of the city, and it's just not fair. The NYCHA residents, my dad drove a bus. NYCHA residents are your civil servants in most instances that are out there serving the city every day. And if you go to NYCHA developments, you can clearly see the mismanagement that's going on. When I go to a NYCHA development and I see a building that's 8 stories high and it has 10 apartments on each floor and the incinerator isn't working, but they put 4 garbage cans outside the front of the building, come on, it makes no sense. We know how to do right by people when we want to do right by people. These residents are residents of the city as well, and we need to ensure that, they're made whole, because we know that stable housing creates stable communities.
You used an interesting word in your response. You talked about the mismanagement of NYCHA. And in going through the solutions, the thing that you focused on, which obviously is the most important thing, is the billions of dollars that are needed to address deferred maintenance. But what about that mismanagement? Do you think that there are other pieces of the puzzle here that need to fall into place in order for NYCHA to really operate at a level that's worthy of the people who live in it going forward? And if so, what else do you think besides just dollars is needed?
I think we need to change management within NYCHA. I think, the NYCHA developments, 316 developments, is too much for the city of New York to manage. We need to break that down into manageable silos and, hire management companies that are, skilled subject matter experts in how to manage developments. We've seen how the process, although it's supposed to be improved, hasn't worked. When I lived at NYCHA, you can go to management and you would tell them an issue and they could repair it. Now we utilize technology that you have an issue and it goes through a system, you put in and there's nobody really following up to see if anything is actually done. So we need more hands-on management. Most developments and, throughout the city that we see managed well every day, they have hands-on management that's paying attention, that's proactive as it relates to maintaining their developments. We need to see the same thing happen with NYCHA. So
I want to move on to another aspect of your plan for affordable housing. You talk about reinvesting in NYCHA, which we discussed. You talk about building more affordable housing, changing affordability standards. One of the things that you propose also is canceling rents and foreclosures during the duration of COVID. And it's certainly understandable that this would be a topic that you would focus on. I think I've read that almost 200,000 households in New York are at least 2 months behind on their rent. So there's clearly something very serious going on here. But I'm just wondering if you can explain in a little more detail what your plan is. Are you suggesting that everyone's rent get canceled? Are you suggesting that only certain people's rents? If so, who and how would that be determined?
What we have to look at is there are people that were really impacted by the COVID. We have almost 420,000 people in the city that are unemployed at this moment. So most people, if we're talking about 200 and something thousand households, most of these people were probably affected by the pandemic, right? The governor asked us to stay home. The citizens of the city did their part and they stayed home to effectuate change. So I want to ensure that those people who have been impacted, that are now unemployed, that, have not been able to have an opportunity to work the way they would have previously, that we invest the dollars that are needed. And we know some of those dollars are already coming to us from the federal level, but we invest the dollars needed to ensure that they're made whole because they've done their part. And for me, the way government should operate is that government should do their part. It's the role of government to make the lives of the residents better. and to make sure that they're okay.
And I'm sorry, so just so I understand, are you proposing then that the city or the state or the federal government subsidize people's rents, or are you proposing that people wouldn't have to pay their rents for some period of time?
I'm proposing that they, if they're behind in their rent, or if they have an inability to pay their rent, that the, government steps up and, pays the rent for them. Because at this point, there are some people that are far behind. And my proposal includes providing grants to the landlords in exchange for rental forgiveness. Because to me, that creates a win-win situation. You ensure that the landlord is made whole, because I'm sure there's been an impact on landlords if their tenants haven't been able to pay their rent. If we provide the grants to the landlord, we're in essence making sure the landlord is made whole, with the understanding that you'll forgive the rent for the tenant and that the tenant is made whole. So we have to be creative about, developing win-win situations. That's what my plan is. I think that it's easier for the landlords to be able to show the lack of payment. We want to make sure that we do this in a way that isn't burdensome on either party.
And let me ask another question relating to affordable housing. And one of the things that you hear experts in the field talk about is that in addition to building rent stabilized units that have caps on the rents that can be charged, another key part of making housing in New York more affordable is just getting more housing production, period. And for that to happen, that means that there has to be development and greater density. And yet in New York today, there seems to be an increasing resistance to development. And especially in the left wing of the Democratic Party, there have been a lot of people who have spoken up and said there's just too much development taking place and we should have less of it. So I guess a question for you is, what is your position on this issue? Do you think that we should be doing more development or less development? And if so, what kind and where?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people that are opposed to development are not necessarily opposed to development. They're opposed to development that people can't afford. We've developed so much within the city. When I look at Brooklyn, especially if you go downtown Brooklyn, it's hardly recognizable, but nobody can afford those apartments. So I think that's what people are actually saying. And I am for development, but I'm for the development of 100% affordable or low income housing. We've done a ton of research and data on the demographics of the people in the city, the family sizes, the income levels. We have to build housing based upon what we know people could afford. And one of the things that we have to do when we are building that housing is create opportunities for ownership. Because people stay in communities and they really build and they invest in the community if they own something. And we should afford that opportunity to everyone within this city. So under my administration, that's one of the things that I'm going to do. We can't say that we want, to address the disparities. We want to address equity when, there are people who are on Section 8 and there are people who own homes. That's not equal. So how do we work to actually towards creating that equity that we talk about, and we know ownership has a way of changing people's lives for generations to come. So when I look at building affordable or low income housing, I want to create those opportunities for someone to actually own something. And it's also an opportunity for the city to actually be able to recoup some of the costs of building. Because if we build with the mindset of selling it for the individuals to own it, we recoup some of those costs back. Less tax breaks and incentives that we can't afford, and looking towards building and doing things in a way that are beneficial to the residents long-term and beneficial to the city.
So let me pick up on your point about what we can afford and we can't afford. I think this year, most experts are saying that the budget in the city will actually be in pretty good shape thanks to money that's coming in from the federal government. But the mayor's own budget plan from January says that next year, the year after that, we're likely to see $4 billion plus gaps year after year after year. And there are independent watchdogs that say that that $4 billion a year budget hole is actually probably more like $5 billion a year if you used more conservative assumptions. And notwithstanding all of this, when I've read through your platform, one of the things that struck me is that you have very bold and innovative proposals, but a lot of them come with sizable price tags. You talk about, as we discussed, making significant new investments in NYCHA, increasing the city budget for affordable housing, which we talked about, raising teacher salaries, funding CUNY so that it's free for everyone, no-cost health insurance, investing in climate, coastal resiliency. I mean, all extremely important initiatives, but also, not cheap. So I guess two questions that I have for you on this topic. One is, do you have any sense as to how much all of these proposals that you're putting forward would actually cost? And more important than that, if you were settling into your desk at City Hall on your first day on January 1st of next year, and your budget director came to you and said, yep, it's true, we've got a $4 billion gap or a $5 billion gap, but how exactly would you address that? Are there some specific examples that you have about where you would raise revenue or where you might cut expenses?
Yeah, well, one thing we know that the city is very good at raising revenue by increasing fines and fees for everything. That's normally the first thing that we go to increase revenue. And I don't see that changing anytime soon because the city continues to do that. So, but as it relates to the cost of these things, the good thing about it is that most of the things that we're mentioning and talking about are already in the budget, right? And if you look at the budget, when I was looking at the proposal, one of the things that struck me is that for the Department of Corrections, we see an increase in the budget between, 2021 to 2025 that is significant. It's 4 times the amount, from when it starts off to where we end in 2024, 2025, which means it says to me that when we want to find the money, we find it, right? But we're investing the money in the wrong places. So that's one of the things that I'm going to look at. I'm going to invest the funds that we do have in a way that's going to give us long-term positive impacts. We should not be investing in additional policing and additional jails when people don't have a place to live. We have to invest in the outcomes that we want. But also, we're going to look at the budget, and even without attrition, we're going to look for cost savings. We're going to look at where we're spending more than we should on various things. And I'll give you 2 examples. Well, the other thing, when I was looking at the budget, I noticed that we're spending $22 million, $22.5 million to buy 100,000 iPads for students, which is great. The average cost of an iPad retail is about $330, right? So we're getting a deal. But one of the things we know is that the iPads are not really compatible with a lot of the programs that the school utilizes. So that's one thing. But we also know that if we purchase Chromebooks, it would be more cost effective. So if a Chromebook is $230 each, and we can get them down to $175, we'll actually save $5 million. So I want to look at those type of things that we're doing to see how we can develop cost savings. Are we getting the best bang for our buck? The other thing, as it relates to the cost that we're spending when we're building affordable and, when we're building affordable housing and housing for the homeless, supportive housing, we're spending right now about $1,400 a square foot. That seems extraordinarily high to me. So I want to do a deep dive into these numbers and see what exactly it is that we're paying for. And that's where utilizing more firms comes in. Because perhaps if we expand the number of firms that we work with, we'll get more cost savings, we'll get more efficiency. So, those are the things that I'll look at as means to be able to pay for some of the things that we're talking about. The money is there. One of the things my mom always said is that it's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have. So I'm going to start looking at what it is we're doing, but what it is that we do have.
The good news for a conversation like this is that we have so many crises that it's not a problem to fill 45 minutes of conversation. The bad news is that we have so many crises, it's not hard to fill 45 minutes of conversation. But so I wanted to shift gears again to turn to a different crisis. Our industry, the 92nd Street Wise industry, the arts and cultural and community sector in New York has really been devastated by the pandemic. The statistics are that citywide, our employment was down about 20% last year from pre-pandemic to the low, and about 30% of that loss came back. In our sector, in the Arts, Entertainment, and Recreation Center, we lost 70% of our employment, and we've only gained back about 5% of that total. But even with all of these grim figures, as we know, we're a city that faces lots of problems. We have rising crime, we have increasing homelessness and housing insecurity, we have racial injustices. So my first question for you is, given all of that, do you think that it's appropriate and possible for city government to prioritize the problems of our sector at a time such as this?
Listen, much like the small business community, a lot of people in arts and culture were struggling prior to. And you have a lot of people who are within the arts and cultures that are independent artists. So we can't look at it as just investing in arts. We're investing in people. And I think that, as a person that's running as a people's mayor, it's very important that we invest in people and invest in things that will make us feel good. Who doesn't love the arts, right? Who doesn't love the arts? I would much prefer to spend $1 billion in the arts than on jails, right? So I want us to start thinking differently and start, thinking about what it is we want to see long term. When we expose kids to the arts at a young age, it expands their minds. It makes them become different individuals. So we have to ensure that we continue to invest in that, and we have to ensure that we continue to, invest in the arts. It's a huge part of New York City. And we can't just say, that's been a lot of the mindset too, because people feel because people are artists and they love what they do, that we shouldn't invest in it. Listen, my nephew is a dancer, right? He just started his own company. Just because he loves what he does doesn't mean that he needs to struggle. The arts need to be supported just like every other industry in the city.
And do you have thoughts and specific plans for what you might do if you were elected mayor to try to support the arts and artists, the individuals as well?
Yes, actually I have a monthly meeting with various artists. It's called Meeting of the Muses. And we talk about what the various artists would like to see. We actually are putting together a letter that we're going to send to elected officials. And it's based upon what they see that their needs are. A lot of the artists, because they are, independent artists, have been, just like the excluded workers, have been left out during this pandemic as it relates to resources. So, that's one of the things that we have to ensure. Do they have the resources that they need financially with, unemployment benefits and with housing assistance? But also, what do they want to see going forward? We talk about supportive housing. We talk about, commercial spaces. But one of the things that we discuss in these meetings is that artists would like to see housing that's built specifically for them. Right? Where maybe we can have, art studios in there, that you have the resources that you need right within the facility that you live. Maybe you have a commercial space that if you're a tenant in this building, that you can rent out a venue that you can rent out to maybe show your art or showcase, your performance. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about working with the artist community and, just being creative and thinking outside the box. Listen, none of this we have right now happens by osmosis. It only happens if we're creative and we talk about what it is that we want to see. And in this moment, I always say, after this pandemic, we don't want to go, back to normal. We want to go back to better.
And speaking of exposing people to the arts and allowing people to appreciate the arts, one area that has been consistently cut for decades has been arts education in the schools. And we at the 92nd Street Y do a lot of work with public schools in the city, bringing arts education back into the classroom. But we've seen that environment becoming much more challenging during the pandemic. What is your thought about continuing to fund or even increasing funding for arts education?
My goal is to increase funding for arts education. I think there are so many things that we're so quick to let go of within, education that are important that we have to bring back. Home economics, carpentry, arts, financial literacy. These are the things that are going to allow us to create whole purposeful human beings. And we have to invest in it if we want to see a different return. If we want to see people who are able to graduate from high school and be employable, we have to make sure that they're well-rounded individuals. So how do we make sure that happens? We invest in it. So my goal is to bring back a lot of things, cursive writing. I was out petitioning and I was surprised how many young people don't know how to sign their name. We've let go of things and we stopped paying for things that are important for people to know and have as individuals. I want to start reinvesting in those things.
So I feel like we could go on for hours, but we're running a little short on time. But I did want to get one question that was inspired by some questions that our patrons asked us. And specifically, we've received a number of questions from patrons on the topic of racial equality, or more appropriately, inequality. And as we talked about earlier, one of the most interesting ways that government has sought to address the economic impacts of racial inequality has been through MWBE programs. And for people who don't know, that's Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise programs that seeks to ensure that a certain percentage of government spending goes to firms that are owned by members of racial minorities or by women. And I know that among your many accomplishments, you were the founder of the New York City MWBE Alliance. So I'm wondering if you could explain for the benefit of our patrons how these MWBE programs work, and more important than that, how, if you were mayor, you would make improvements to those. And I know you touched on some of your ideas, but I was wondering if you had other thoughts that you wanted to share.
Yeah, sure. How the program is supposed to work is that 30% of the contracts, 30% of that $22 billion that the city spends is supposed to be procured with minority and women-owned businesses. And unfortunately, that has really been a challenge for the city. The statistics and the numbers as it relates to utilization have been really low. And how do we change that dynamic? We change that dynamic by changing the procurement process, making it easier for firms to be able to get access to opportunity. We change that dynamic by one of the things I talked about earlier, developing a graduated deposit program, ensuring that firms are paid in a timely manner. But we have to understand why this is so important, because we need to ensure that the diversity of the dollars going into the pot match who and how those dollars are spent. And when we talk about all of the other areas that always continue to be, presenting challenges within this city, education, crime, all of those things, this is one of the ways that we can address it. Because if we ensure that these firms are getting opportunities, they're going to hire locally. They're going to hire within their community. The individuals that work with these firms that are doing work with the city are going to be paid a living or prevailing wage, which will allow them to live better lives. So, this MWBE goal is extremely important, and we have to work towards changing that dynamic intentionally. And as mayor, that's what I plan to do.
Well, that's a great note to end on. There's so much more that we could discuss, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I wanted to thank you very much for sharing your plans for the city with us, and to say also to our 92nd Street Y patrons Thank you for supporting and tuning into the Race to City Hall series. Please check back on our website for the most up-to-date schedule of future conversations. And in the meantime, from the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y, we're signing off. We appreciate your joining us. Thank you.